Welcome everyone to the Hangul Typography Workshop. This is a two-day workshop. So today is our first day. On Thursday, same time, same place, here on Zoom, will be the second part. This is part of Korea Week, which is hosted by the Korean Consulate here in Toronto. And this will be a workshop, as the title states, and we will be going through what Hangul is, how it came into inception, the history of it, and we'll do a few exercises and talk a lot about Hangul in pop culture and just culture in general. Yes, Reyna, thank you. Happy Korea Week, everyone, by the way. So to start us off, Mr. Kim Duk-hwan, the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in Toronto, has prepared a few words for us. So we will, I will share the screen and we'll hear from Mr. Kim.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this workshop on Hangul and Korean typography. Thank you for your interest and participation in today's event. This event is organized as part of our 2021 Korea Week Festival. Each year, the Korean Consulate in Toronto organizes a series of events in October to celebrate Korean Heritage Month in Ontario. This annual festival provides a wonderful opportunity to share Korea's rich and dynamic culture, art, traditions. I am very pleased to kick off this year's Korea Week with an event that introduces Hangul to participants in Canada. Hangul represents Korean language and culture, but is also very adaptable and easy to learn for others around the world, with an alphabet of only 14 consonants and 10 vowels. I hope today's workshop provides you all with a new understanding and appreciation of Hangul. I would like to thank Kyung-sik Park, Director of International Relations for the Korean Society of Typography, for leading today's workshop. Thank you all for your interest in Korean language and culture. Have a wonderful time.
So today's workshop will consist of these 4 parts. We'll look at a little bit more introductions. Then we'll go into our first lecture for today, Hangul, a modular writing system, and we'll be introduced into the inception of Hangul, how it came to be, how it sort of survived, and look at how it actually works. I think this is the most important thing. And then at around 8:20, maybe we can take a 5-minute break and then return back and do our first activity, which will be building blocks and names. And this is where we'll be actually doing the writing of your name in Korean. And then at around 9 o'clock, 30 minutes before the session is over, we'll have our second lecture. I'll be looking at Hangul in pop culture. So this is basically what we'll be looking at. To introduce you to the sponsor for this workshop, the Korean Society of Typography. It's an academic society that's based in Seoul. And we have been sort of promoting and developing Korean, or Hangul rather, in a more contemporary aspect. And so, sadly enough, it's not an international society, but, and we're still relatively young. We started in 2009, and we are currently building out and involving more international events and participation. So hopefully, in the next year or so, we'll be able to have a branch, no promises, here in Toronto as well. Okay, so Hangul is a unique writing system to Korea. It is based on the vernacular speech of the Joseon dynasty. Roughly in the 1400s, there was a language that Koreans were speaking that was unique to Chinese or Japanese or to other regions. Hangul was designed or built or invented to unify and standardize the indigenous scripts that were used. So what they were doing before, when they were writing down this unique language that everyone was speaking, was using Chinese. And so the image on the left, you'll see, on the right rather, is showing you the records of that time and how Hangul sort of differs from the vernacular of Chinese at that time. What's also interesting here, if you can see my mouse, is that these are Hangul. These geometric sort of shapes here that you see are Hangul, and everything that's sort of in a brushstroke, and quite complicated really, because Chinese is a very complicated written language in itself, is all Chinese. And so the first version of this script that we're calling Hangul right now was geometric and was very uniform in shape. This is interesting because the main writing tool at that time was the brush. I don't have a brush with me. It wasn't a pen, but if you look at the shapes themselves, you'll see that it's quite unique. It's hard to draw these block sort of geometric shapes with a brush. It's much more easier to write in this sort of form or this sort of style, if you will. So that's the interesting thing. Later on, we'll look at Hangul and how it adapted itself to the writing tool, the brush. But we'll get back into that a little bit later. This is actually the first manuals, if you will, about, oh, this is the first, this is a consonant, and this is how it should be pronounced. So it's the letter and the explanation that we're seeing here. Again, you can see that really stark contrast of how Hangul was actually a different invention altogether from the standard or the vernacular at that time. The key word that I really want to point you to here today is modular. And modular is a word that you've probably heard of in like space stations or sci-fi movies where everything sort of is built to sort of click together. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. When we're talking about Hangul especially, it being designed, introduced as something totally new to a culture, it has to be easy. And hence, if you are thinking about introducing a language that is simple, it has to sort of click together, if you will. And that word modular sort of has a different facets as we're going along. But we'll be, just to keep in mind, modular is the key word that we'll be looking at a little bit later. So who invented Hangul? King Sejong, the fourth king of the Joseon dynasty, in 1443, proclamated that the people should have their own unique language so that they can express their own unique needs, their wants, their unique sort of characteristics. And so over the course of a couple of years, Hangul was gradually developed, tested out, and sort of introduced to the masses of the time. Where that sort of idea comes from, I guess, is sort of inherent inside of how King Sejong reigned, how his reign was rather. His reign was from 1418 to 1450. He was a devout advocate of Confucianism. He was a military strategist. And I think this is the most important thing. He developed science, technology, and architecture. And if you look into it a little bit deeper, Hangul wasn't his only invention. There's a sundial that he did. There's a water clock, I believe, that he also developed and invented. And so he wasn't just a lounging ruler, if you will. He was very acute to what was needed, what was going on through the times, and was able to sort of look past. An innovator, if you will. An innovator who was able to find the needs of actually what the Korean people needed, and that was a writing system. The Joseon dynasty of that period was quite peaceful as well. So that also laid a background for many people to immerse themselves in the culture, to develop science, to think about abstract things. And so that sort of background really laid the foundation for Hangul to be developed. 1440s for the Joseon dynasty was very much steeped in Confucius teaching. We were very much under, not under rule, but something similar to how Korea, the relationship that Korea and the US have, was very much similar to the Ming dynasty of that period and the Joseon dynasty. And it was a time of relative peace. And as I said before, that sort of lays the groundwork for things to develop, for innovation to happen, if you will. So this is the Hunmin Jeongeum. This is a proclamation, if you will, which is followed by a manual of how to use Hangul. And the introduction is what you see before you. And I think it's important to see what the introduction is. Hunmin Jeongeum in Chinese, translated to English, roughly means the correct or proper sounds for the instruction of the people. And this was published or issued, I guess. The royal issue was in 1446. And what it actually says here in Korean or in Hunmin Jeongeum is, so I've sort of expanded upon it, I think is useful for us to sort of consider and to find out what the actual intent was that King Sejong had in making Hangul. If I can read it for you. Because the speech of this country is different from that of China. The spoken language that everyone was speaking at the time, does not match the Chinese, the writing system that they had back then. Therefore, even if the ignorant want to communicate, many of them in the end cannot state their concerns. And here we're talking about concerns that are unique to the Korean people. Saddened by this, I have had 28 letters newly made. And when we say newly made, we're going to look at it just now. But it's quite literally newly made letters. It is my wish, that all the people may easily learn these letters and that they may be convenient for daily use. So the intent is, and you can't say it any more clear, really. The intent of King Sejong was to have a writing system that was unique culturally in every aspect of Korean life, specific to the Korean culture, and to have that be different from the other countries that were surrounding them at the time. So it's the intent of how or what is happening here is quite, I guess the word I want to say is noble. Maybe that's something that we can all agree upon. Noble, and how that came into fruition basically stems from this noble intent. Okay, we have a Junie So has a question. We'll just address this before we go on to the next part. Was Korean Chinese text at the time written, read from right to left, top to bottom? Did this continue after the full conversion happened? Very excellent question. If I can just go back to perhaps what Junie is talking about. I hope I'm saying your name right. These are probably the best examples. Yes, everything was written vertically, if you will, from right to left instead of left to right. So the way we read today in English is horizontally from right to left, from the left side of the page all the way down. If I can do this, and then to the next page all the way down. But traditionally in Asia, not just Korean, but Chinese, Japanese, is totally the opposite. It's up to down. Yes, up to down vertically from the right page to the left page. So it's this, if you will. Yes. It's an interesting question because once we reach into the late 1800s, when Japan takes over Korea, and then the subsequent sort of events that happen after that, suddenly, just out of the blue, Korean is suddenly read in the Western style, the way that we read it, from left to right, horizontally. And we'll be touching upon that just briefly, but I will address a few issues that were related to that as we progress within this class. Excellent question. Thank you, Junie. Yes. So before I go on, just to keep in mind that this is a very modular. This is today's keyword, and this is the letters that we are being introduced to. This is Hangul, the consonants, and as you can see, they have a few similarities in how they're shaped. You can see the kiok, and the nian is basically a flipped image here. Tigut and lier seem to be distant cousins. Mian, biut as well. Shiut, jiut, iyung here, and the one on the far left, the hiut, the one with the little hat. Oh, sorry, over here, hiut. These are all forms and shapes that have, how can you say it, a design intent. They look like how they should be pronounced. And we'll look at that just now. As a reference, below are the original consonants that were introduced in the Huminjeong. And you'll see that some of them are not in existence today. This one over here, the guy with the little horn, if you will. The guy with the flat top, if you will. Then there is a triangle. These are no longer in circulation in contemporary Hangul. That's because the word I'm looking for is the phonetics of it are overlapped by other letters. So just something to keep in mind. These are actually the ones that are in use today. And of interest are these guys in the middle. And these are tense consonants, as I've written out. But it's interesting to note that these are kind of different in how they're pronounced. It's not a double. This is kiyo, and the pronunciation would be ku. But if you double it, it actually makes a more tenser sound. So the tongue pulls back a little bit further and makes a ku. So it's almost like a more guttural sound, if you will. If I can give you another example, this is du, so it's like a D. But this has a much more of a guttural sound, so it's du. So these I find are often new pronunciations for people who haven't been speaking Hangul. And so these are things that we can talk about just a little bit later. So these are the consonants, and these are where they're actually coming from. So if we can imagine, and because everyone is muted, you don't have to be conscious of how you're pronouncing it. But what we're going to do is try to find inside of our bodies where these shapes are coming from. So we're going to look at the velar consonants first, and we're looking at this one first. This is gyo, so it's pronounced gu. And if you can feel that sort of echo right around here, or right around where the diagram is, you'll feel where that's coming from. So it's gu. And to give you a little bit more context, this is ku. And so that it's almost like it's bursting out here at the mouth. So it's ku, gu, ku. And I encourage you to try this at home. Again, because we're all muted, there's no one else to hear you unless you have a spouse or a sibling or a partner sitting next to you. Maybe they can also participate as well. So let's try that again. Gu, you can see it here, right about here. Ku, as it sort of bursts out. This is shio. It's an S. It's very much an S. This is jiu. It's a J, if you will. So it's j, j, j. And so it's almost here. And then this is ch. It's almost like a CH, if you will. Ch, ch. So again, one more time. S. You can see it starts maybe somewhere around here. And then j, j. And then ch sort of shoots it out. Ch. S, j, ch. And all these explanations here, I'll just leave for you to read, because it clearly explains what we're doing. So just by going through it, I think you'll have a very good idea of how these sort of these forms of these consonants are taking shape. And then, of course, we have the tongue and how it sort of interacts with the roof of, hold on. Sorry. We'll begin with Nian. So this is N, so N, N. And you can feel the tongue sort of touching the roof of the mouth, N. What we want to do is go up and look at the Diut. Diut is D, D. And you can really feel that sort of echo in the chamber of your mouth. D, 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 D. And then Tiut is T, T, T. It feels like it's hardly touching the roof of the mouth. So it's T, or if I can start from the beginning again, N, N, and then D, 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 and then T, T, T. Now the hard one is this one, the Rier. Rier actually does a really strange thing. So think of an R and an L at the same time, an R and an L. Or L, 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 L. And you can feel the tongue slowly retracting back a little bit towards further down the roof of the mouth as it goes L, 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 L. And so, as I said before, modular, we're taking this basic shape here and we're adding to it. And it gets a little bit more complicated here, almost like a double tap here. And so we're looking at that shape and how that signifies how one shape sort of builds the other similar pronunciations within that group. I can just go back and sort of show you. So you have this diagonal strokes here. Then you have the little top. Then you have almost like a double top, if you will, or double tap, if you will. You have the kiot, and then you also have a marker that stresses a little bit more. So again, going back to the idea that yes, there is a method to all of these shapes that we're looking at. The last one is the mouth. Oh, sorry, not the last one. The fourth one we're going to look at is the mouth. And here is where we're going to be focused on. And this is mium. Yes, it is a square. Mium. And it's basically an M. 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 So this pronunciation is made basically with your lips. M. M. And there's that, again, that sort of echo in it. If you add it to a bit more, then it becomes a B or a B, a B, B, B. And then a totally different sort of pronunciation, but yet similar to what we've been sort of doing here, is it sort of explodes out like P, P. So it's almost like it's exploding, if you will. That's how I always imagined it to be. So as it explodes, it sort of keeps the shape of the P, but it has its own unique shape. So P, P, B, U, B, M, M. So these kind of shapes all sort of group together, and they sort of build up on the previous shape. Then the last one we have is the iung. The iung is a circle, and that's found here. So those of you who are from Hong Kong or from China or know how to pronounce the ng, the ing, this is probably a good reference for that. Ing, iung. So you can feel it here, and that's the pronunciation that we want to make for iung. As it comes up here, we have the guy with the two hats, with the top hat. And this is hiet. This is the very last consonant that we'll be looking at. And hiet, as you can see, starts from here, but it sort of hits the roof and comes out as an H. Hiet, hiet. So here. So this is what we want to look at. Again, we have that sort of similarities and how one sort of builds into the other. And so those are the consonants. And quite literally, what we're looking at is King Sejong and his the scholars were saying, well, we have all these pronunciations, and how will we make it easier for the commoners and the masses to be able to find the words or find the pronunciations that they need for everyday life. And so naturally it starts from here. These are all the pronunciations that we need to make. Let's start building something that's easier for people to reference, if you will. And so building it out from kiok, gu, to k, to sh, s, shio, jiu, and chiu, and being able to make just those really quick marks to differentiate between those different pronunciations is what we're looking at. It's quite ingenious, if you will, and how those things were made, how those things were sort of introduced to people of various sort of statuses, of educational levels, and of different occupations as well. Something I'll be looking at later on, I think, on Thursday, on how that actually happened. Before we go on to the vowels, just want to make sure that we have enough time. There are no F or THs in Hangul. So that's something to keep in mind later on when we're writing our names. So if you have an F in your name, it's probably better to write it out as P. If you have a TH in your name, then it's probably better to write it out as a D. Okay. So the vowels that we're looking at right now, these are the vowels that are currently in use. And again, as below, Hunminjeongeum had these basic vowels that we used, that were first introduced. The interesting thing about the vowels is it takes these basic elements and sort of builds out upon it. And this is a very Confucius sort of concept that we're looking at. So the dot signifies the sky or the heavens. The vertical stroke is the man, and the earth is, the horizontal stroke is the earth. Depending on where that little dot is placed, we have that idea of yin or yang or positive or negative. And so that is basically the design structure, if you will, for how the vowels are sort of met out. Okay, so starting with this basic sort of center pronunciation, if you will, the lines or strokes that you see represent how the yin and the yang would be pronounced. The yin and the yang were pronounced. I'm just giving you a basic idea here. And so what you would have here is a o in comparison to an u. And then you would have a u in comparison to a yo. They're very subtle differences, but let me go back to them again. So you have a o and a u. And again, I encourage you to, even if people behind you or at home are snickering, ignore them. Try this out. This is actually quite interesting. O, u, yo, and yu. So there is that idea of in music where there's a higher and a lower sort of tone, and that's actually what we're trying to find right here. If I can move on to here, a and o, ya and yo. So if we're taking the idea of the yin and the yang and how they differ in tone, then that's our basic sort of foundation to increase out into all these different kinds of pronunciations. What's really interesting is what we've done here is sort of reduced the ones that are in circulation today. Admittedly, you can have 2 strokes here, you can have 3, you can have 4, but as I mentioned here, our vocal cords or the muscles in our throat haven't evolved to sort of make those kind of slight little differences yet. So these are the ones that currently are in use right now. Before we go on to the little bit that's left over, Yvonne is asking, what sound does a triangle make? The triangle actually makes something that's very similar to the biu or the b, but it's kind of mixed up with the s, so it makes a ps sound. Ps. Let me say that again. Ps sound. 필수. Kimberly is asking, do you think that as language continues to evolve and Korean borrows words from English or other languages, that new consonants might be added like the TH or V sound, which is a very important question, Kimberly, because on Thursday, we'll be talking about a few type designers in Korea who are actually trying to introduce different consonants that are that do represent TH or V or F. And so we'll be looking at that the second part of our workshop. An excellent question. And I think many people have that sort of difficulty. It's something that people kind of take for granted in their own language. And so that transition is always kind of difficult. But there is actually something of historic value to also mention, which I'll be going back to when we're talking about that specific type design. Are there any other questions before we finish up with the idea of Hangul being invented or designed as a modular system? Oh, Junie is asking, was there a differentiation between R and L as well? In Hangul, no. There is an R and there is an L, but how they're built in as a syllable sort of defines if they're an R or an L. But the 리을 itself can be switched out with an L or an R. Do consonants and vowels, May is asking, do consonant and vowels only combine up to 3 parts? No, it actually gets quite complicated. And we'll be looking at that just now after we look at a few more questions. Will this be mentioned on Thursday? Oh, okay, so Junie's got it. And Hillary is asking, can you comment on the dialects if Korean is the main language? Like how come there are so many dialects? Oh, dialects on how things are pronounced. I think that goes out of the scope of the writing system that we're talking about is Hangul. But just to briefly mention that, because I think we have a few minutes before we go into our lesson for today. Yes, there are quite a bit of dialects in Korea. And you all know that Korea is currently divided into North and South Korea. And so if you include all dialects that are in the North, there are, to my estimation, and it's a bit old now, but there are close to 40 different unique dialects that are being spoken in the Korean Peninsula, both North and South. Jeju Island has its own unique dialect. People on the west and the east side of the coast, Gyeongsang and Jeolla, all each have very unique different dialects even within their own region. There's even a Seoul dialect. And so, yes, I think because Korea has such a long history, and because I guess it also sort of extends out to this idea of what we're talking about with Hangul right now, is how culture has sort of built up upon itself, and the introduction of all these different languages have sort of made that possible to have people sort of pronouncing things in their own unique way. But that's as far as I'll take it for today, because we want to really focus on the writing system itself. So I will return back to, I'll turn on the chat just for one last question. And Wing is asking, how long did it take to standardize the use of Hangul across the entire country and stop using Chinese characters as the standard? Ooh, that's a very difficult question, Wing. So when King Sejong announced that there will be a new writing system, for the first few years or the first few decades, it didn't really take off as a national language. And we'll be looking at that a little bit in more detail on Thursday, but it was quite tumultuous. And it was only after the Korean War, or perhaps during the Japanese occupation, as some scholars would have it, that that Hangul rather became the national language. Hangul, that name itself, wasn't really introduced until that time. So what we're looking at now, everything that King Sejong was doing, didn't really have a language, a name for it. It wasn't called Hangul at that time. It was just called the national language. So that's something to keep in mind, because when we revisit on Thursday, you'll be able to understand and put things into a little bit more context. But yes, it's been a really rough ride for Hangul to be introduced as the national language. And the second part of that question, stop using Chinese characters as the standard. So in many ways, the Sino-Chinese is still used in everyday life in Korea, meaning that a lot of the majority, I would say, of all the names that we have. So my name is Park Kyung-sik. That those names have a Chinese equivalent. My last name can be written in Chinese. My first name Kyung-sik can be written in Chinese. And I expect everyone here who have Korean names that aren't pure Korean names will have an equivalent in Chinese. So it's very much still part of the language, if you will, or the culture. And I think that is equal for not just Korean, but also for Japanese. And in many ways, Taiwan has their own set of Chinese. But again, those are all different sort of differentiations, rather, of how Chinese is used in each culture. So hopefully that's not too confusing, Wing. And hopefully we'll be able to touch upon that on the second part on Thursday. Okay, so here we are. One thing to sort of be mindful of when we're reading Hangul is that the Latin alphabet follows a baseline. So this purple line that you see here, the D, E, S, I, G, and N are all sort of laid out on that unseen line. Hangul, and not just Hangul, but Chinese and also Japanese, don't follow this linear pattern. It's actually a square that we're thinking of. So in each square are the individual syllables that we need to pronounce. So this can be pronounced as, so there was tiut, du, and then there was nien, and then this was a. So put them all together and they become dan, or D-A-N, dan. And then this is pung, p, and u. They kind of stuck together, but u, and then the pung. So each of these squares signifies a syllable. And so what I would like for you guys to do before we actually get into the activity is to think of your name and divide your name into each of the syllables that it consists of. So for instance, Wing, since you're the last person who asked the question, you have only one syllable, so your name is very easy to write in Korean. Hillary is Hil-lo-ri. So that's 3 syllables, right? Okay, just to keep that in mind. And so that's interesting. So if you were to follow the pronunciation pattern of the Latin alphabet, it would be just basically a straight line. But in Hangul, you go all over the place. And keeping in mind that everything is within a square should be able to help you on how you are going about writing your name in Korean. So quite literally, it's this easy to write your name in Korean. Here what I've done is I've divided the vowels with the consonants. So the blue or the dark blue or electric blue is the consonants, and that pink or that dark pink is the vowels. Okay, so that in mind, we are going into the deep end. We are going to make your name in Hangul. So take a moment to think about your name. If you're really brave, you can also do your last name as well. It doesn't really matter. But again, as I said before, divide your name into syllables. What I've done here is I've taken Toronto. And Toronto, I've divided into 3 syllables. So there will be 3 squares that I'll be making. So if you have your pen and pencil ready, draw a tall, not a wide, but a tall square for each of the syllables that are in your name. Then use the vowels and consonants that I've written out here, and slowly try and find all the letters that pertain to each of the syllables. Does that make sense? To give you an example, this is what I've done. The next step I won't show you because I want you guys to take some time to see if you guys understand it on your own. But in English, those 3 syllables will sort of look like these at the top here. And then if they were to be placed vertically, in that same square, they would start maybe looking like this. Okay, you guys think you can do that? But right now, the time I have is 8:20, which is perfect. Maybe until 8:30, we can see where we are. And if you would like, if you can open up your videos and maybe show us what you've done for your names, and we'll take it from there. There you go. Okay. So Reyna works. Okay. All right. So everyone's up and ready now. Okay. This is very interesting. Karen, Wuhan. Okay. Amber, we're waiting for. Sophie, we're waiting for. And there's 4 slides I have to go through. So keep it up until I say, not to. Vicky, there you go. Okay. Hold on. Okay. Doesn't seem like anyone else. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I really like them. I like the colors that you used. Oh, Sohanjun. Shonaru, excellent. Okay. Do not throw these away. Put them in plastic. Hold on to them because we'll be looking at them on Thursday. My name is Nanda, but I go as Nanda. So you're flying, Nanda. I'm flying. Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to turn you guys off again. And so, yeah, it's quite literally, if you have the language set in your computer, it's quite easy to write your name in Korean. If you understand the principle and how all of Korean is actually written, keeping in mind that everything is a syllable inside of a square, and it's actually easy to sort of see how Hangul actually works. So within a matter of an hour or so, I would say, you're able to write your own name or to write basic words in Korean. The last part of today's session is Hangul and pop culture. And strangely enough, if you guys are thinking of Parasite or Squid Game or what's the other Netflix show that's on? Oh, yes. Sorry. Is it turned off now? Yeah. DP, I think, is the other one. You were sadly mistaken. We want to focus on Hangul and how it's seen in popular culture outside of It's Okay Not to Be Okay, yes. Vincenzo, yes. Everyone is very, very much versed in Korean pop culture, if you will. But what I'd like to focus on is how it's sort of taken out of that Korean context and sort of used in various different ways. I don't know if you've seen this movie rather. It's called Moon. It was released in 2009 with Sam Rockwell. It's only Sam Rockwell through the entire movie, but he's been hired by a tech company, a Korean tech company, and it's not apparent until you start seeing these little hints. Sarang, when you see it, is like, oh, okay, it might be some different foreign language. But then when you see him exercising inside of the capsule that he's actually in, you can see the Korean sort of working there. And it's an interesting sort of play on the idea that Korea is very much a technologically advanced. Well, there's a lot of companies that do a lot of tech. And so that sort of pop culture relationship that's being shown here was interesting. The other one that I didn't put in was Collateral. It's a movie by Michael Mann, and that's actually much earlier than this movie that we're talking about, where Tom Cruise is a hired killer, and he's going in through LA, And there's a few scenes where all these neon signs are written in Korean. That's an interesting sort of idea. I believe it was one of the Marvel movies where Black Widow was careening through the Avengers, yes, were careening through Busan. And then again, you also actually saw the actual scenery of Busan and all the Korean letters that were there. Black Panther, yes, exactly. Something that I found a little bit more interesting was in 2017, they had a reboot of the Blade Runner movie. This time calling it Blade Runner 2049. And in that scene, this is Ryan Gosling coming into a deserted building. You guys can see this, right? Because I just got a window that says the application isn't showing. Okay. If you look at the top here, it says Hangul, and I believe that he's going into a bank. And when I saw it, I thought, oh, they wrote bank wrong. It should be Heng. So it should be without this little piece here that I'm covering with my mouth. So it should be Heng instead of Heng. But then I realized, oh, so he's coming in, so it's actually reversed. So it says Heng-un, which in Korean means luck. So it's sort of a visual device, I guess, that in this scene, Ryan Gosling is going into a movie where he lucks upon a big clue that sort of breaks open the entire movie. So it almost seems like a, what's the word that they're using these days? It's a clue, not a clue, but anyway, the words escape me. An Easter egg, yes. Thank you very much, Byron. It's an Easter egg that sort of alludes to the entire story, but strangely enough, written in Korean, when it's very much a Hollywood movie. These you've probably seen as well. This is Yoo Ah-in. He's a very famous young Korean heartthrob actor. And in 2013, I believe, is when he started releasing these very interesting t-shirts. And they turned into t-shirts, but also like sweatshirts, and a whole line of these were created. But what's interesting about this is he's taking those letters that we were talking about, the consonants, the vowels, and sort of applying them to Korean, to English, to, in this case, very famous locations all over the world. So if you know them, then it's easier for you to pronounce Seoul, New York, and K for Tokyo, and Lille for R, Paris, Paris, without the S. Again, Lille, London, again, Lille, Milano. And what this sort of did for me was, oh, this is a really great way to introduce how to pronounce all of these different consonants that we have in Hangul and the vowels that we have in Hangul as well. And so this is sort of at the time when I was doing more research on how the pronunciation of Korean has sort of changed over time from its inception in 1443 until now. And this was sort of an introductory device that I used in various seminars and classes. Beyond the fact that it was really well known because a really famous actor started this line and was actually promoting Hangul to a much wider audience. So again, this is an excellent example. And then the final example that we have for today is the fashion designer Izanbo. He has been showing his fashion line for many decades. But I think it was in 2011 or 2012 when he happened upon the idea of using Hangul as a pattern or a textile for the line of fashion clothes that he was making at the time. The interesting thing here, and this is something that we'll be touching on Thursday, is it's not geometric. It's very much the calligraphic brushstrokes that he's really focusing on here. But his other work actually takes the geometric forms and shapes and applies them in a much more broader sense, not just like prints on a jacket, but the actual silhouette or the contours of the clothes that he designs actually are referenced from the consonants and the vowels. This is another heartthrob Korean actor that many of you that may know. So that's Izanbo. So fashion is also a very big fanboy, if you will, of Hangul. Just to give you a little bit more context about Korea, about Hangul rather, and I'll just jump over to this one first, is a movie that was released a few years ago called Nara Marsami, The King's Letters. And this is basically talking about how King Sejong actually went about creating Hangul. The whole turmoil, the building of the actual research or the scholarly institute. Institute is probably too big of a word, but the organization that will be in charge of making these letters. And so it's interesting to see. It's a movie that is, in my opinion, very politically sort of energized, if you will. It's a very opinionated movie, if you will, as all of these movies tend to be. But to give you a little bit more context on how it was created, I think would be an interesting thing for you who are interested in Hangul and the history of it to actually look at. Like all of these period pieces, these are, it's beautifully filmed. The scenery, the stage, the props, the costumes, they're all beautifully well done. So just for the eye candy of it, I would strongly recommend. And Wing, yes, you should definitely watch this movie since you're taking this workshop. And something that's a little bit more contemporary is 말모이. 말모이 is the pure Korean word for dictionary. Dictionary in Korean these days has the Chinese equivalent. 사전 is how you pronounce it. If you can see it over here, 사전, that's dictionary. But the pure Korean, so there are no Chinese equivalent to 말모이. 말모이 is just Korean, just pure and simple. But that name is the name of this movie, which is the story behind the 우리말 큰 사전. So this is the first Hangul 사전 or dictionary that was developed during the Japanese occupation. It wasn't published until after the liberation, but the efforts that obviously these people here of the Joseon 어학회, this is the Joseon language society, if you will, is the ones who were secretly developing the dictionary during the Japanese occupation. So this is actually a movie that is a bit more contemporary, that is talking about Hangul. It dives into a little bit more of the contemporary sort of tumultuous side of how Hangul sort of was really sort of striving and struggling to exist as a unique language for Korea. So that's something that I would definitely recommend for you to watch as well. As I said before with the King's Letters, this is also a very politically sort of driven, opinionated sort of movie as well. It's by no means a documentary, but it again sort of shows you the era of the Japanese occupation, how Koreans were sort of, even after 30 plus years of struggling with it, it was still a difficulty for people to use Korean, even though they were Korean, and to sort of go through all of that turmoil during that time. So yeah, in popular culture, I think it's important, I think, to talk about popular culture in the context that it really reflects the concerns that people have of the times. And when we're talking about Hangul, I think just because the whole interest that the Hallyu, the K-pop, the movies and everything have been having over the years, just how it sort of slowly permeates into our everyday, not just Netflix, but in so many different ways. It's interesting to see how Hangul is being sort of portrayed in popular culture. And these are just a few examples that are interesting and sort of might be helpful for you to further your journey on finding out about Hangul. Hillary is asking, what was the movie you mentioned with Tom Cruise? What was I saying about Tom Cruise, Hillary? Yes, Collateral. Yes, Collateral stars Tom Cruise and Jamie Foxx. Yes, thank you, Reyna. Okay. So for Thursday, please find 4 individual shapes, or I'm using elements for this, but it could be anything. It could be stickers, like circle stickers that you find at the dollar store, or it could be little cubes that you have, or you can buy a bag of those as well at the dollar store, or it could be a set of stamps that you have, something that you can repeat with relative ease. Nothing too elaborate, like or Legos might be an interesting thing to sort of have as well. If you have multiple pieces of Lego, those might be something interesting. Good. Yes, Legos. Legos would be an excellent element to bring. So what I'd like for you to do is take time to say, okay, this is one element, and another one, and another one, and another one, and have 4 different elements ready for Thursday. Along with that, if you can get a large sheet of paper, something that's tabloid size or even bigger, just so that you can practice and sort of make everything as big as you like, around 5 sheets, because we're going to try it out first, and then nothing is ever perfect on the first try. So we'll look at it, and then we'll try it again, and we'll start making those elements fit into place. And as I said before, those beautiful names that you showed today, please keep those handy so that we can look at that and reference for the second project that we'll be doing next week. Yes, that's okay, Hillary. We'll revisit that idea and before we start the project on Thursday. Why sometimes names like Hyung are written in English as Hyung? Oh, that's an excellent question. So a few years ago, the English pronunciation for Korean went through a whole upheaval. And so all the subway stations, all the bus stations, all the government official names, they all went through a huge overhaul in English. And so in aims of trying to make the Korean pronunciation a bit more exact, I guess, in English. Yes, that's the main reason. But I prefer the old way of writing. I find that the EO is not very easy to pronounce. It's not very familiar. And so people tend to pronounce it as Hyung or Hyung instead of Hyung. And so I think that's something that, it's either going to take time or some people will have to reconsider, or I guess we'll have to reconsider how we write our Korean into English. But yes, an excellent question. Anything else? Okay. I think that does it for me today. I will see you on Thursday for the second part of our Hangul Typography Workshop. Again, if you have any questions, please don't, just disregard them. Please keep them in mind and have them ready for Thursday. And I'll be ready to answer your questions. And we'll see you Thursday. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Junie, especially. I hope you'll be here on Thursday, too. Will you? Thank you. Lifesaver.